What's up, guys? Welcome to the season finale of Mets Off Day Live. I'm Niki Lattarulo, joined by two SNY contributors, John Jastremski and Hannah Kaiser. Guys, thanks so much for joining the show. Unfortunately, everyone's worst fear finally or somehow has come true. Mets no longer hold the third and wild card spot. Dropped two straight to the Nationals. Now they're tied with the Reds for the third spot. But remember, Cincinnati owns the tiebreaker because of their head-to-head record, which means right now the Mets are on the outside looking in. So, JJ, I'll start with you. Only 6 games left in the regular season. What do you think the Mets' chances are of making the playoffs?
Well, I'll talk in odds terms, Nikki, because the odds makers in Las Vegas and at FanDuel and at DraftKings and at MGM and all these places, they've had the Mets favored to make the postseason basically the entirety of this season. Well, for the first time on Monday, the Mets are now plus money at plus like 136 or plus 138 to go and be a playoff team. Well, in layman's terms, what does that tell you? It tells you that the Mets have fallen off a cliff. The fact that the Cincinnati Reds are now favored to go and make the postseason, it should have you with a whole lot of sleepless nights. It should have you absolutely sick to your stomach. And the sad reality for the Mets going into these final 6 games of the year is that they no longer control their own fate. So, yeah, it's all well and good. The Mets have to go and play good baseball. Yes, there is a pathway for them to go and make the postseason. But let's not ignore reality. The Mets have been, statistically speaking, one of the worst teams in baseball over the last 4 months. That is not exaggeration. That is not hyperbole. I understand how much talent is on this roster. They are double-digit games under 500 since the month of June. So it's asking a lot of a team that has not been able to find answers to now basically snap their finger, wave a magic wand, and figure out how they're going to go and make up this ground, which is, again, not a whole lot. It's very manageable mathematically, but the eye test tells you there's a whole lot not to like.
Yeah, Hannah, I think I saw something that said the Mets were in a playoff spot since April 5th, and this is the first time they're actually out of it. What do you think about their chances?
So it's interesting that the odds makers like the Reds a little better because Fangraph playoff odds still have the Mets with 51% chance of making the playoffs and the Reds with 42% chance of making the playoffs. So the Fangraphs, the sort of statistical modeling that's looking at the teams themselves still says this Mets team is a better team, but those models are pretty inertia prone. They change very, very slowly. They're not working off the eye test. Those models are saying, listen, true talent wise, if we just look at these two rosters, Cincinnati Reds versus New York Mets, it feels like the Mets should have a better chance. But that's kind of how the Mets have been talking these last couple of months, where, as JJ said, they have been playing pretty poorly and just not looking like the talented team that it should be when you look at the roster. So I think that's interesting that, like, even down to the wire, the prediction models are saying this Mets team is talented, but if you're watching this Mets team, you're saying this talent doesn't always come together in a successful way. I still think that Fangraphs is right. I'm in that same sort of, this team feels like it is just more talented than the Cincinnati Reds. I'm actually a little bit more concerned about the Arizona Diamondbacks. I think that's a really good team. That lineup is good. But just looking at the Reds versus the Mets, I still feel like the Mets are the more likely postseason team, but they have played themselves into a really tricky spot at this point.
Yeah, it's honestly crazy we're having this conversation because we were like, oh, the Nationals are coming up. They should be fine. But losing 2 out of 3 to the Nationals, and they already lost 2 out of 3 to the Nationals the last series. So it's just almost like, how did they get themselves in this situation? So they close out against the Cubs and the Marlins. The Reds face Pirates and Brewers. JJ, which of those teams have an easier path down the stretch?
Well, it depends on what you mean by easier because, look, Milwaukee is clearly the best team out of anybody you'd be matching up with, but we have to question motivation. Are the Milwaukee Brewers of the final 3 games of the year going to be real motivated to play their very best? Are they going to be lining up pitching? Are they going to be giving guys maintenance days knowing, hey, we have everything wrapped up going into the final weekend? I would be petrified of the Miami Marlins. That is a team the Mets are playing over the weekend. They've won like 10 out of their last 11. They've played really, really good baseball. They've exceeded a whole lot of expectations. And I don't want to be the Grim Reaper, but we've seen a couple of Met years in the past, 2007, 2008, I know the script was Shea Stadium. I know the venue was New York City, and it was the Marlins coming to town. But we've seen these years where the Marlins go and end the Mets a year, and it caps off a collapse. I don't love that juju. I don't feel good about that notion and that narrative. But one thing that the Cincinnati Reds have working against them, the Pirates stink. They are going to face Paul Skeens on Wednesday. So you're going to need the big boy to come through in a big way. But all of this is irrelevant as far as path is concerned, gang, if the Mets do not go and play winning baseball. We could talk about schedules. We could talk about who has motivation, who doesn't have motivation. If the Mets do not play a good brand of baseball over the final week of the year, they're not making the playoffs. It's as simple as that.
No, I agree. I think it's one of those situations where the Mets could have the easiest schedule, but we know they can lose to easy teams, and then they can go and beat really good teams. So for the Mets, I don't really think it matters who they're playing. They just have to play their best baseball. So, Hannah, that leads me to my next question. Do the Mets need to win out in order to get into the playoffs?
I think not, because I think the Brewers are going to be playing hard, if not playing for something, in that last series against the Cincinnati Reds, because the Brewers have already locked up a first round bye. They're skipping the wild card round. They'll go right to the division series. So as much as they won't be playing for anything in particular, and they're certainly not going to push their pitchers super hard or let anyone get hurt, they are going to be getting everybody reps. They're going to want their best players out there working out, because we've seen in the past this expanded postseason where the division winners skip the wild card round, those 3-game wildcard series, sometimes a little bit of rust sets in. So I think the Milwaukee Brewers will be competing hard in that final series just to take it seriously themselves. I mean, they're going to need, from now until the division series is a pretty long layoff, for the Brewers to take the gas off the pedal completely. So to get back to the schedule, I agree. I like that JJ brought up how good those Marlins are, because I was going to bring that up too. I think the Marlins are they're sneaky good. They're technically not eliminated from the postseason yet. I don't think the Mets need to win out completely. They do have to face Paul Skeens. The Reds are facing Paul Skeens. They're going to face this really good Brewers team that I do think is going to be playing competitive baseball. So I think they can afford to lose a game or two, but you would rather not see them do that. I mean, we're talking about playing these pretty weak teams, the Pirates for the Reds, the Marlins for the Mets in the final week of the season. And on the whole, this has been a down year for the NL. The fact that it comes down to this for the Mets, not to make every answer come back to doom and gloom, this Mets team is such a disappointment, but they are, I think, 7 games below where they were this time last year in terms of record. It should not come down to, can you beat the Miami Marlins in the final week of the season to save your season. This is a weak NL field, and they should not be struggling to beat the Nationals or worried about beating the Marlins. So I think they can do it, but the concern is troubling.
Yeah, and the concern pretty much this whole season, or at least the back half of the season, has been the starting pitching and how they can't get deep into games, and the bullpen really can't carry them. So, JJ, do the Mets have the starting pitching to carry them through this next stretch of whatever, 5-6 games?
To carry them, absolutely not. To complement them, sure. It's going to be a team effort. The Mets do not look at their complexion of the team and say, wow, our starting pitching is the strength of our team. It's the big 4 guys you have in the lineup. It's Edwin Diaz closing out games. And look, having Nolan McLean pitching the way he has been able to pitch is a major, major asset. But let's just look at Tuesday night starter David Peterson as a perfect example. David Peterson was an all-star in the first half of the year. In the second half of the year, he's been dismal. I mean, he's not been able to go and get anybody out. So I think if you're looking at the Mets playing well over this final week, yeah, they're going to have to get well-pitched starting games. It's going to help the cause. It's going to make the Mets look like a better baseball team. But from what we've seen over the last 3.5 months, does anybody expect the Mets to roll out 6 top-notch exemplary starts? I, for one, don't see that. They're going to need a bullpen to come through. They're going to need a lineup, more importantly, to come through, and hope that they're playing fundamentally sound baseball. It is crazy thinking about how this final week is going to play out. And those 3 guys right there, you see all the youngsters, they're all up. They're all part of this thing. They're going to have to be a monstrous part of this thing, because basically it's like, hey, young bucks, it's you and the mound, or it's your performance or lack thereof, either putting us in or keeping us out of the postseason. Crazy world.
Yeah, it's crazy to think those 22-year-old, 24-year-olds are the ones that are really a big part of this Mets, hopefully, playoff push. Hannah, when you look at this team, what one person, I know it's hard to say because it kind of feels like everyone isn't doing great, needs to step up the most in order to keep this team up? It's not even fair to say. I feel like it's not possible one person can make a change, but if you have to put your finger on one person.
JJ brought him up. I was going to talk about David Peterson as well. First of all, I think he's the only one. We don't exactly know. They haven't announced their pitching plan, but from the looks of it, he's the only one who's going to make 2 more starts in the final week. So just by virtue of appearances, he's got a chance to change the sort of landscape a little bit. But he should be that should give you confidence. Like from last year's All-Star game through the end of July this year, David Peterson had a 2.74 ERA over 210 innings. He was the 6th best starter in Major League Baseball by ERA. That was a long stretch. That's middle of last year to middle of this year. You would have said, we feel great about having him make 2 of our final 6 starts. Since the start of August this year, 6.99 ERA, almost a 7 ERA. That is a huge swing in terms of just the confidence you feel about those starts from David Peterson, what it means for the bullpen, what it means for the rest of the starters. I mean, they don't have Kodai Senga, the best version of Kodai Senga. They don't have the best version of Sean Manaea. Clay Holmes was such an interesting and exciting pitcher at the beginning of this year when they converted him from a reliever, but we're getting really, really deep into sort of how many innings past his career limit we can get. David Peterson, that should be your steady grown up in the rotation. So I think it comes down to, can he bring the guy who he was for a full calendar year up until the last 2 months?
The grown up. We have the kids and then we have the grown up starters, and the grown ups haven't been pulling their weight. The Mets also haven't had the best of luck. We know they haven't been playing great, but some things just don't seem to go their way. Last night, Jacob Young made that catch off the wall, bounced it off his foot, got Brett Beatty out. You're going to see that right here. Gary Cohen said maybe the fates aren't in the Mets' favor. JJ, does it feel that way, or has this collapse been self-inflicted with just playing bad?
So when it comes to Sunday's game specifically, yeah, when you're seeing a guy like that playing hacky sack and making an unbelievable defensive catch, it kind of makes you think it's not meant to be, especially when he goes and makes this spectacular play on Francisco Alvarez in the 9th inning. But as far as what we've seen over the last 3.5 months, no, I don't think it's fate. I think it's just bad baseball. That's what the Mets have delivered as far as the product on the field is concerned. They have not hit with runners in scoring position to a high enough level. Their starting pitching has fallen off a cliff. They have not had answers within the bullpen. And recently, they've played a sloppy brand of baseball. They were incredibly sloppy in the game they played on Saturday that, let's be honest, they had absolutely no business losing. So I don't look at it and say, yeah, it's fluky what has happened to the Mets, because the evidence and the body of work over the last couple of months has kind of gotten us to this point. And if there's something remarkable about where we stand going into the final week of the season, with the way the Mets have played, they should be dead. Let's acknowledge this. The fact that the Mets are still mathematically alive and basically within a game of the Cincinnati Reds, it's troubling, disheartening, sickening from where the Mets were in the month of June. That's true. But statistically, you play like this for 3 or 4 months, you don't make the playoffs. That's just usually how baseball works.
Yeah, I was actually thinking about that when we started the show, and I was like, wow, it's crazy. They're even like still in this playoff run. It brings me to this. Back on June 12th, the Mets were 45-24. That's 21 games above 500. Right now, they're just 4 games above 500. So it goes to show that thank God they built themselves that lead, or they would have been so out of this a long time ago. So Hannah, if they miss the playoffs because they were once 21 games above 500, is this the worst collapse in franchise history in your opinion?
Well, that depends. What feels worse, Mets fans? A rapid collapse or a slow unraveling? What was it? It's the 2007 collapse where they were up by a bunch and they lost it all to the Phillies in that final 2 weeks. I'm remembering that positively from Phillies' perspective. Yeah, with the 7-game lead in the division on September 12th, the Mets lost 12 of their last 17. That collapse was probably more, I don't know, collapsy. But this gets back to what JJ was just saying. This is just a bad season. This is a bad team. At some point, what was the demarcation line? That post-June demarcation line matters more than what you did beforehand. So this is maybe the more if they miss the postseason, I think this is the more disappointing season on the whole, because they should have never It should have never come this close. You shouldn't be able to collapse. I hate to bring up the payroll, but they're such an expensive team. They're such a talented team. They did build that cushion. I think it's less about this collapse in the final month and more about just what is wrong with the construction of this team that they could lose such a big lead so steadily over those final few months.
And the fact that the NL is weak, and the fact that they were once in the lead for the NL East, like it was just like death by a thousand cuts. I feel like slowly you were like, oh, I don't know if they're going to come back from this. And that might lead us to Carlos Mendoza. A lot of people are putting the blame on him. JJ, do you think that the second half struggles are really like more than the second half struggles fall on him? And do you think if the Mets don't make the postseason, he should be fired or he will be fired?
I do not think they will make a managerial change because there was just too much goodwill from Mendoza's first season. Steve Cohen is a guy who wants to win. I think he has a very aggressive approach as far as spending money. But I also think when it comes to people that he employs, and David Stearns and Carlos Mendoza kind of fit this description, he has shown a decent amount of patience. And I think he believes in what the Mets are trying to build from a long-term vision, long-term future. Now, let me make something clear here. Despite the fact that I don't think the Mets are going to make a managerial change, when your team plays like this over 3.5 or 4 months and you're the leader of the team, it's your responsibility to try to figure out what's going wrong and how can I get my team out of it. Do I think Carlos Mendoza's had a particularly good season? No, I don't. And I think the sloppy play and I think what you've seen over the last few weeks, and a man who continues to come up to the podium, and I know he's not swinging the bats, I know he's not pitching, I know he's not fielding, but it's your baby. It's your team. It's your show. And when the product is what it is and there's no answers, you got to take a hit for that. Doesn't mean you get fired. I don't think that should be the case for Carlos Mendoza after this season. But I don't know how you can look at his job performance or anybody within that organization's job performance. If they missed the postseason, this 2025 season is an unmitigated disaster. Case closed.
Yeah, Hannah, if you're a Mets fan, do you want him to be fired? Is he to blame? Like, if you're a Mets fan, you're watching this collapse, whose fault is it?
I understand that if you're a fan, you probably want someone to be fired because it does feel like an unmitigated collapse. I don't think it is Carlos Mendoza's fault. It's tricky. We really don't know. Evaluating managers is like the last sort of black box in sports. I feel like, like every year someone wins manager of the year because their team overperformed, and often teams who underperform, the manager gets fired. But those can trade back and forth, year over year. We saw it last year to this year. I would not put too much of the blame. We're going to get into this. I think that the way the pitching staff was constructed was a flaw, and it was a flaw a lot of people saw, and it was a flaw a lot of fans had frustration with. And that is a particularly tricky spot for a manager to be in. Listen, I don't know what he was supposed to do when all the pitchers coming back from injury were performing so poorly. The team was reluctant to call up the rookies, whether or not that was merited, because listen, the way they've handled the rookies has obviously panned out okay so far. So maybe that those extra few weeks in the minors was necessary. But I think that listen, someone needs to answer for why the bats weren't working in the first few months, even when the team was winning. But the way that it has unraveled feels so tied up in the construction of the pitching staff that it's hard to lay too much blame at the manager, who is working with pieces that are flawed, that are injured, that are young guys. Like that is a tough spot for a manager to be in.
Well, I'm going to let you just continue with what you were saying. So looking back, what do you think they could have done differently to avoid that slide? Do you think it was constructing the starting rotation, or do you think not calling up the rookies? Like when you say that was flawed, how would you avoid that?
More pitching in the offseason would have been great. I think everyone was asking for that. But even I think that I understand the way that David Stearns likes to construct a pitching staff is a little bit riskier. He's looking for upside. He's looking to piece it together. He's looking to convert relievers to starters and have that pan out. And it did super well last year, and it did okay at the beginning of this year. I would have brought up, we talked about this, I'm sure, on BNNY points. I would have brought up at least one of these rookies when all those guys were on the aisle. So when Senga and Benaya were initially hurt and they were really going sort of start to start, how do we get through every 9 innings every night? They were really reluctant to bring up the rookies. And it doesn't feel like that's when the team collapsed. It's felt like it's been more recent. But a win an extra game there, you're in a different position now. So I would have called up the rookie sooner or been a little bit more aggressive at the deadline with starting pitching. I know there wasn't a lot of starting pitching moved. I'm sure that's because they were asking really high prices for guys like Zach Gallen. But like, you take a look at Shane Bieber. The Blue Jays took a flyer on Shane Bieber, who was coming back from injury. He hadn't pitched at all this year, and he's been really solid for Toronto. That unwillingness, I guess, to sort of go bold when it comes to finding starting pitching at the deadline, that's come back to bite them.
Yeah, I do agree with the younger pitching, at least call one of them up. So then it didn't seem like everyone was coming up at once. But
yes,
neither here nor there. Hopefully it doesn't come back to bite them and they do make the playoffs. But let's take a look ahead at next season, maybe when the season is behind us and things work out. Pete Alonso expected to opt out of his contract this offseason. JJ, do you think this will be another long, drawn-out, high-profile free agency process? Or do you think the Mets right away will try to lock him up and give him the money he wants?
So maybe this is the optimist in me coming out. I can't imagine it's going to be the dog and pony show it was last year. I just can't. Pete's had such a productive season. He's so important and so crucial to what the Mets want to be from an offensive standpoint. And he means a lot to the fan base. He should be a guy that's a lifelong Met. This is a guy you don't mess around with. Pete Alonso should be a Met. Let's not beat around the bush. Lock him up 4 or 5 years, not have a repeat of what we saw last year in the offseason. And from Pete Alonso's standpoint, I have to assume after a far more productive 2025 season, his interest level is going to be far greater and far more significant than what it was a year ago. So let these teams drive up the price. Steve Cohen and David Stearns, financially speaking, run an organization that can afford to keep them, and let's not mess around. Pete Alonso needs to be a man.
Yeah, Hannah, I mean, like JJ just said, he had much better year this year, batting .321 in his last 15 games. Like, he's been the one that's kind of been producing hot and cold, though. Do you think his market value will be higher than last offseason?
I think his market value will be higher from a AAV, an average annual value perspective. I worry that Pete himself is looking for a longer contract than teams are necessarily comfortable giving out to first basemen in their 30s. I hope that the Mets get it done quickly, because I agree with JJ that if you're David Stearns after this season, regardless of how this next week plays out, I don't know how you face the fan base and say we can do without Pete Alonso. You quite clearly cannot. You needed his offensive value, but you need that win, that fan service in a way. I don't think David Stearns can face the fan base and say, sorry, we let Pete Alonso walk because, he wanted 5 years and we only wanted to give him 3 or whatever. But that's if he only wants 5 years. I'd be concerned that Pete is looking for a much longer contract. I am very curious to see what happens with Kyle Schwarber and how that does or does not affect Pete Alonso's market, because it feels like Kyle Schwarber is almost certainly going to go back to the Phillies, and the Phillies love him. And it's a similar sort of situation, even though he's not a sort of career one-team player, where it's a guy who hits a lot of pop on offense, not a lot happening on defense, into his 30s. The team loves him. It feels like they couldn't have gotten there without him. And the Phillies tend to be a little bit more willing to open the purse strings. I understand that they don't have the money of Steve Cohen, but I'd be curious to see if they bring back Kyle Schwarber really quickly, does that have any impact on Pete Alonso's market, to see sort of whether that drives up his market, makes him think he could drive up his market, or if it encourages the Mets to act a little faster.
Yeah, it seems like the Mets aren't the Mets without Pete Alonso. Like, most fans would rather him be on the Mets and give him the money. They know Steve Cohen has the money. So I personally think he'll be back on this team. Edwin Diaz is also likely to opt out. David Stearns, we know, likes to cycle relievers. Mets have used the most pitchers in MLB history this season. JJ, will Stearns be willing to pay Diaz what he's asking for? Because he's had a really good season too.
He's been fantastic. I can't imagine where this Met bullpen would be without him. However, there is a tricky fine line in paying a closer and giving a closer a serious long-term deal with the volatility of the position. Now, Edwin Diaz has been here a good chunk of time. He's been here since 2019. He got off to a real rocky start. He had a season for the ages in 22, then the injury, and he's all the way back from that injury. Here's the problem. The 2026 Mets are really going to need Edwin Diaz. But if Edwin Diaz is looking for 4 or 5 years, that's where, as an organization, you have to sit there and say to yourself, Do we want to take a chance here that we're going to be eating a whole lot of money in year 3, year 4, year 5 of that deal? Because the history of the relief pitching and the closing would tell us that we probably are. So, look, I love Diaz. I don't know if the Mets can replace Edwin Diaz. So it's not my money. I'd bring him back. But I would say there should be a buyer beware attached to his label. If you're giving him a long-term contract, just know the back end is not going to look nearly as good as the front end. Just saying.
Yeah, definitely can't give him anything too long. Hannah, do you think he's in a Mets uniform in 2026?
I don't. I'm with JJ. It's not my money. I would love to bring Diaz back. I'm very emotionally invested in the Edwin Diaz journey. I don't know why. Something about the injury at the WBC just made me really, really affected me. I was like, God, is he ever going to come back? And you're right, JJ. He has. And I hope the Mets make a deep, exciting postseason run and he gets to go out on top. I think that David Stearns doesn't really want to pay for starting pitching, doesn't really want to pay for relief pitchers, and doesn't really want to pay for aging sluggers. And I think he's going to have to pay for 1 or 2 of those positions this offseason. And I bet that it's not bullpen.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to my next question. Looking at the bigger picture, JJ, I'll go to you, and then Hannah, you could jump in. Do you think that they make a big splash in free agency, or they have this younger core and they kind of will like lean on those guys that have already dabbled in the big leagues this year?
So if this season ends up floundering over the final week of the regular season, we're talking about the Mets either not making the postseason or going out quickly, let's say in a 3-game series to the Los Angeles Dodgers. I almost feel as if Steve Cohen is going to need to go and make that big splash in some capacity. What that might be, not sure at the moment, but there will be a move where Steve Cohen has to say, okay, you're spending a ton of money on tickets. We went and got Juan Soto last year in the offseason. I don't know if there's a Juan Soto equivalent. There probably is not, let's be honest. I mean, the idea of taking Juan Soto away from the Yankees and putting him in right field, I mean, that is as Broadway as it gets. I don't know if you have that Broadway type of offseason move, but knowing the way Steve Cohen thinks, as far as just observing him own a baseball team. I'm not spending one-on-one meetings with Steve Cohen, but watching the way his baseball team has been run since he's taken over the New York Mets, my gut would tell me some sort of big splash would happen.
Yeah, Hannah, do you think if it gets to that, they'll end up going the free agent route, and if so, who do you think you could see them trying to grab?
I think Pete Alonso is the free agent splash. I think they're hoping that's the one that the fans are okay with. Because listen, I really do think that the offense, there's always holes you can fill, but they built a strong offense intentionally. The Juan Soto, they're not going to be able to add someone of that caliber offensively. I always think you need more starting pitching. I would love to see them add a starting pitcher, but I have to admit that what we've seen from Jonathan, Nolan McClay, and Brandon Sproat these last couple of weeks does give me some confidence that they have in-house options. I think obviously they'll need to. I think they'll let Diaz walk, and I think they'll need to rebuild the bullpen a little bit. What they did with Ryan Helsley at the deadline, that didn't work, so they're going to need to find someone cheaper than Edwin Diaz, but more exciting and something of a little bit of a sure thing in the relief market. I don't know. I think if fans are looking for a splash, I hope they're excited about Pete Alonso coming back, because that feels like the likeliest splash.
Yeah, maybe this season was just a fluke and then everybody plays up to their potential next season and there's no barely making it into the postseason. So let's just look ahead one more time to the end of the season. 6 games left. Final predictions from both of you. Here's the end of the season. They got the Cubs and then they got the Marlins, and then we don't know if they're going to make the playoffs. JJ, how does this season end for the Mets if you had a crystal ball?
Gang, I hate doing this because I feel like I have minimized the Reds and I've minimized the Diamondbacks and the entirety of the National League feel. I hate to be the Grim Reaper, but I'm going to be the Grim Reaper. I don't think the Mets are making the playoffs. I don't like the vibe. I don't like where we're at.
I guess.
Gang, they've not been a productive team on the road. They're going to have to go now and play 6 road games. Realistically speaking, I think 4-2 minimum gets you into play. I think 4-2 you have to go to feel confident you're getting in. You might need 5-1. Have we seen that sort of stretch within the Mets on the road recently? The answer is no. Go shut me up. Go prove me wrong. I'm highly skeptical we're seeing a playoff team.
Hannah? I know we both were like, what?
I think they go 4-2, but now you've convinced me that they're going to go 4-2 and miss the postseason. I think they go 4-2. The Reds go 4-2. and then it comes down to that tiebreaker. There's
Well,
something
they're
about
out. That's the worst thing. They don't have the tiebreaker. They're out on both counts.
And that really drives home the fact that, like, we could talk about what they're doing right now, the way they've looked the last couple of weeks, even the last couple of games against the Nationals. But I think it's going to come down to you just had to win one more game at some point this season, and you'd be. I think they're going to go 4-2, and they're going to lose out of the tiebreaker.
I think they're going to make it. I just think this team, as much as they've stunk and as much as they haven't had the vibes, I think somehow they're going to pull it out, and we're just going to be like, okay, of course they did that. And then I kind of feel like they're going to make a run in the playoffs. I don't think they're going to win the whole thing, but I just feel like a playoff run is going to happen. There's no way this team misses the playoffs. That would be shocking to me, but who am I to say? I'm just guessing, but I just can't picture them missing the playoffs. So hopefully we look back at this and I'm correct, but who knows, guys. So like we said, Mets open their second to last series tomorrow. Cubs, Chicago, David Peterson expected to make the start if nothing crazy goes awry. But that is it for Mets Off Day Live. This is our season finale. Huge thank you, JJ and Hannah, for joining us, and all the contributors that have joined us on the show. Thank you, everyone, so much for watching. And we will see you back here next season, hopefully with good news of how this season ended.